Welcome! In this video I'm making a new body for a Washburn electric guitar, then customizing it with a transparent pattern plywood top with some strip LEDs. So stay tuned and watch the whole video. You can see how you can transform your little hatchet into the coolest looking shreddable axe. My name is Ray Whitby and this is Ray Whitby Creations. Your immediate question is probably, did the lighting kit interfere with the sound of the guitar? Well, I won't spoil it, but there were some interesting challenges that I had to solve along the way, including when I drilled straight through the lighting circuit after sealing the LEDs within the body of the guitar. If you make it to the end, tell me what you think about the project, the approach, and also the final effect. Let me know in the comments below. Whilst I'm taking this Washburn apart and learning how it must have been assembled, let me stress what this project is not about. It's not about the quality of the guitar sound, and yes, there was some sound. And it's not about how to perfect a glossy finish, and I had some major problems with the 2K spray. And it's definitely not about my guitar playing skills, because I think skills is probably too strong a word for it. What it is about is the customization of a guitar body to put on an elegant top and a lighting system. And it was really trying to integrate the ideas of a transparent pattern plywood, which was part of a previous project, into a much larger system. With the guitar disassembled, it's then on to making the transparent pattern plywood. And I covered this in a lot more detail in the video that should appear in the top right of your screen. In this project, I'm using scrap Sippo mahogany, utility wood, and thinning it to 2mm strips. Then they're coated in epoxy resin, which will minimize the release of air bubbles when curing in the much larger system. This is a prototype project, and I had no idea whether it would work or not. I've not built an electric guitar before, though I have made an acoustic guitar, which actually you can see in this video. Whilst there were some skills that were transferable from the acoustic guitar build project to the electric one, there was still a lot more that I needed to discover. So a rapid learning curve, especially when it came down to the electrical wiring. I 3D printed a number of these comb-like widgets to hold the utility wood so that I could pour epoxy resin between the layers, and this generates the alternating wood and resin needed for the transparent pattern plywood. The assembly of this mould hadn't got any easier, and I'd still love to see a way of making long lengths of transparent plywood where it can be cured within a pressured system. As a result of the design requirements, I had to build a new body for this guitar. The original body had a sloping surface on the lower bout. Now I could have built that up, but making a new body would be a lot more fun. It did mean making a number of jigs and templates based on this original Washburn body, and then I could keep the original body for guidance, in case I got lost along the way. But it just meant that I could transfer everything else from the Washburn, well actually apart from the wiring, which after being stored for 20 years, had some issues that meant it just couldn't be revived. The transparent plywood blanks are somewhat deceptively small looking, yet the volume of resin it took to fill it was large. Thankfully I didn't have to worry about the colour matching across different mixes, given that no dye was used at this stage. The idea was to have the RGB LEDs provide the backlight colouring. Once the so-called transparent plywood was cured, I could then cut them into patterns. Somewhere along the road I decided to go for the Alpine Tops layout, though there are many possibilities to choose from. So if you were doing this project, which pattern would you have chosen and why? Let me know in the comments below. I made a bit of a mistake here. When cutting on the bandsaw I should have left the tails on both halves longer, so that when it was glued together, the tails could have been trimmed to the final length, and then all these pieces would have been matching in dimensions. I glued both halves together using an epoxy resin glue, and just checked the top and bottom surfaces just to make sure that they were in alignment. Then each block was cut into smaller pieces of about 4mm in thickness. Then it was to work out whether I actually had enough pieces for this project. The original body came in useful to trace the outline of the guitar, then to dry fit the pieces into a repeating pattern. With enough pieces available, I created a shallow mould in a rectangle. It meant a bit of waste, but it should have kept the pattern in better alignment this way. To try and cover any minor gaps, I used a black dye within the resin. Inevitably, I wasn't careful enough. I think probably due to the subtle differences in the sizes of the tailpiece for each alpine top, and that probably led to an increasing misalignment of the pattern in certain areas. And no matter how much you jiggle and poke them, it became like herding cats. You would try and move one piece into place, and then four others would suddenly move out of position. Also, I'm not sure if it's a distraction, of just mixed epoxy resin that has that glossy shine, and therefore it's difficult to see where the gaps are forming? Or is it just the panic of trying to get a few hundred pieces laid down quickly and capture it on camera before you make any further mistakes? Anyway, the gaps were far easier to spot once the resin was cured. If you're wondering why I laid down these 4 strips of ply within the mould, well, that's just simply to stop the pieces from floating away from the base, which they tried to do. Had to go old school in preparing the top. I needed to get it down to a near uniform size before I pushed it through the drum sander, and I hadn't used a handheld planer in about a decade. Almost forgot they existed. I do love drum sanders, when they're wide enough for the projects you have in mind. For this entry-level machine for the workshop, they did stress that it's not to be used for thicknessing, but I couldn't fit this through the planer thicknesser, so with a lot of patience, then you can do some thicknessing with a drum sander, but it takes a lot of patience. Hopefully you can see that this is the effect I was after for the transparent pattern plywood, allowing light to pass through. And now for building the body of the guitar. I'm using scrap wood, which is probably some ghastly soft pine. It had quite a few knots in. But for a prototype, and whilst I'm still trying to figure out how to build an electric guitar, it made sense to not use expensive tone woods. It's a 2-piece body, and I'm over-engineering the glue up to try and keep both faces as flat as possible. Right, how do you know when a guitarist is extremely worried? He starts to fret a lot. I'm not going to show the making of the templates and jigs in this video, as it will just simply make it far too long. But just to say that with patience, it's fairly straightforward to create the jigs from an existing guitar body, and then modify them as needed, like for this particular project. And having the techniques will expand the possibilities for your own custom guitar jobs, so don't shy away from jig making. It takes a while, but definitely worth it in the end. This cool template allowed me to map out the cavity of the guitar body and where the LEDs were going to be positioned. I created a deeper version of this template for the routing jig. Now I had to use some different approaches to holding the templates in place, and I tried using 2 bits of masking tape and CA glue between them, but if you have a large enough blank for the body and knowing where the pickup holes are going to be, then you can use screws to fix the jigs into place, knowing that the screw holes will disappear eventually. The depth of the cut was experimental. Here I went for about 5mm initially, and then after a lot of procrastination I went down to about 10mm. And this was in order to try and get better diffusion of the lights. I wanted it to appear like there was a uniform light across the guitar body, rather than a series of discrete LEDs. Reality, however, matched the latter. With the internal light cavity routed, it's on to cutting the form. Then I used a flush trim straight cut round a bit. Crikey, that's a mouthful. Which, as you can see, must have been getting a bit blunt. It felt like I was pushing rather than guiding the piece across the router. Not too problematic. For the burn marks that were left, the edge was going to be sanded anyway, and then painted over. But definitely required placing an order for a spiral cut flush trim router bit. I sealed the light cavity with epoxy resin, and then the external surface of the body with sanding sealer. Then sanded the external surface down to about 400 grit. It was then onto a quick bit of boreholing for all the other cavities, just to make the routing a little bit easier. And after checking the fit of the guitar neck, I routed all other cavities only partway to its final depth. The idea of only routing to partway of its final depth on the top cavities was so that I could then drill through the transparent pattern plywood top to each of the cavities below. Then I could use a flush trim router bit to shape the cavities on the guitar top, and then router down to the exact depth I needed. And at the time, it made perfect sense to follow this method, but I'm not really sure why. Anyway, I used a couple of rattle cans to paint the body, but for some reason decided to prime the body first before completing the internal wiring, and then went back to the painting. Again, it made sense at the time. For the lighting, I kept it simple. I used a straightforward LED strip with a remote control, but they did have rather pathetic 4-pin connectors, so I created a port to attach the power lead to the LED circuit within the guitar body. And the power lead and the remote control sensor could be tied to the guitar strap and basically kept out the way. But of course that left a rather flimsy connector going into the body. So somewhere in my head it also seemed the right thing to do was to keep the input power far away from the guitar wiring as possible. It was a chance to show off my non-existent soldering skills. Now, once upon a time I did have an electronic engineer show me how to do proper soldering, and I just wish I'd paid attention. Nonetheless, even my rough and ready technique was sufficient, and everything had lit up. The laying out of the LED strips was a nightmare. These strips are not flexible enough for this job, and it left a lot of kinks in the strip. Not that it affected the circuit at all. I tried using these angle connectors, and I wish I hadn't bothered. And unfortunately, the layout itself just wasn't dense enough for my liking. But hey, this is a prototype. And so far, it kind of works. Here, I'm rough sanding the bottom face of the transparent pattern plywood top. I did try a couple of different ideas to help diffuse the lights from the strips, and the best I could figure out was only to come to roughen the internal face of the top. The top was glued onto the body using a quick curing resin. Then the excess of the top is roughly trimmed. The spiral trim router bit finally arrived, and then it did take off the rest quite cleanly. I'm sure if I had used the slightly blunt router bit, it would have torn those alpine top pieces to shreds. If you've never done flush trim routing before, be wary of any holes along the surface you're running the bearing. Physically check before committing to the routing. After using a shallow roundover bit to take the sharp edge off the top, it was then on to wet sanding. So I started at about 400 grit and then went up to 5000 grit. Any further operations on the top would have to be done carefully so as not to scratch the surface. The transparent pattern plywood top is finally drilled through to where the cavities are lurking beneath. The cavities on the top are then trimmed flush and finally routing down to the correct depth needed. Drilling the pickup lead channel led to a major disaster, but I wasn't going to notice that for quite a while. So here I am carrying on blissfully unaware, and then finally move on to getting the back of the body sprayed black. Obviously, I had protected the guitar top before spraying. It's all then coated with a glossy coat, and then I plug in the LEDs, only to find that part of the strips were working. As I said, major disaster. A close examination shows where I had drilled through a lighting strip buried inside the body of the guitar. I had to lift a number of the Alpine top pieces, then reconnect the LEDs as best as I could. Everything was resealed, and then had to resand the top. The repair was pretty good because I couldn't see any visible signs of having torn through the top. But at that time I just thought the project was irrevocably ruined, and it took a long time to figure out how to actually do the repair. But after I calmed down, I think the motto I'll have to say is never say never until you've exhausted all possibilities. I mean, seriously, you just got to try what you can and see if it works. And even if it doesn't work, well, at least you've learned something as a result. After following all the correct steps for coating the guitar, I then used a 2K gloss spray. Even though I searched for all help available for this product, somehow the final finish leaves holographic-like fingerprints when touching the glossed up black areas with moderate pressure. Maybe it's a Duff can of 2K, maybe it was something else. If you've got any ideas, please let me know in the comments below. Thankfully this wasn't for a customer, so I wasn't too aggrieved. I used a conductive paste in the pickup and the wiring cavities, and once that was dry, it was then on to reassembly. Fairly straightforward. I mean, I only had to re-drill the bridge twice. I couldn't get a like-for-like wiring replacement in time, so I had to butcher a 2-tone, 1-volume, 5-way switch, and I still haven't got a clue if I've wired it up correctly. They provided me with 2 diagrams and nothing matched. Nonetheless, the guitar is complete, and now to test it. At least the sounds are coming through nice and clean. Until you switch on the lights, that is. Hopefully you can hear that every time you change the colours, you get this weird sound effect going through it as well. Let's try music mode. So unfortunately, get a weird effect. And what we're going to do is just disconnect the power supply unit. I'm going to plug it in to a 12-volt battery pack. So you still get that weird noise with every light change, but you don't get the background hum. some clicking going on in the background. It's got its own synthesizer somehow built in. But thankfully single colours appear to be okay to a certain extent. Some colours cause more issues than others. So I think what we have to do is swap it out for an Arduino controller and see if that actually makes a difference. I don't have the copyright, so I can only play a few bars. And there you have it, a new body with a customised top with some lighting. Let me know what you think of it in the comments below. Did you like it? Do you think it was worth the effort? What kind of pattern would you have gone for? And has anybody had success in voiding that humming in the background with lighting effects? Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please click on like and subscribe, and why not leave a comment? Till next time, take care.